Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week and Archive 360. I'm Dave Leafort with Compliance Week, and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is titled, It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your data is? Before we hear from our presenter, let me first review the agenda. We're scheduled to go today for 1 hour, and after the presentation, there will be a short Q&A session. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I will pose them to our guest at the end of the presentation. After the Q&A, I will wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please use either Google Chrome or Firefox as your web browser and disable your pop-up blockers to be able to access the exam. Once I've signed off and the webcast is completely over, the final exam will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have any trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving your CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. Once again, to ensure receipt of your CPE credit, please make sure to use either the Chrome or Firefox browsers. And if you missed anything here, I will repeat these instructions at the very end of the webcast. A few other details about our console here. At any time during the presentation, you can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. If you want to increase the slide size, you can hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the top right of your screen. And lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen if you need any assistance. And now I'd like to welcome today's speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce George Tziahanas, Vice President, Compliance at Archive 360. George has extensive experience working with clients with complex compliance and information risk challenges. He's worked with many large financial services firms to design and deploy petabyte-scale complaint books and record systems, supervision and surveillance, and e-discovery solutions. And with that, welcome, George, and I will turn things over to you to get started.
Great. Thanks very much, and thanks, everybody, for joining. So today we're going to cover really a handful of topics that are relevant in information risk and compliance today. We'll look through the obligations that are common and commonly associated with your data, a view on what I call integrated governance, data sovereignty, which is definitely a hot topic right now, AI and ML, and then how do we look at leveraging a common approach to try and address a combination of these obligations. So I use the word obligations because it really is a series of not just requirements that are derived from whether it might be regulatory or other affirmative requirements that you have, but there's obligations around the data that you have that's intrinsic to the kind of business that you're in as well. But one of the things that you'll see is that there's this tension today between the value and risk of information. Typically, we think about information value decaying over time. But what we've also seen is that with the tremendous advances in compute and analytics, we can start to actually derive a lot of value over even older data or develop and correlate data between large sets of information that we previously couldn't because we just didn't have the compute to do it. So now we can derive value, but at the same time, those risks are increasing over time. So if you look at a traditional view from a graph perspective, or if you were looking at this from a curve, right, the value decreases over time. What I like to think of this, though, as there's a point at which the risk of leaving this information around, at least in the operational systems, starts to actually exceed the value that you might be able to derive over time. And it makes sense if you think about it. And I was doing some work for a healthcare company that had been acquired and done some of their own acquisitions. And as we were looking and doing the analysis of their data sets, we realized that they had highly sensitive information in very unprotected environments. And they were really in legacy environments. They had been acquired. They had gone through a couple of different integrations, and these systems just had never been retired out properly or closed down. And it makes sense too that over time you start to forget the information's there. You don't have the same types of controls that you might have in the newer systems or newer environments that you're using. So it makes sense that you'll see this risk increase over time. So the affirmative obligations that are generally associated with information are really based on a couple things, right? So one is you've got a legal or regulatory purpose for which you have to keep this information for some period of time. But just beyond, not just keep that information, the regulatory and legal purposes might also be the ability to find it or search it or take some action with it. It's important to understand all of those different things that apply to that common piece of information. So one of the things you'll see is that a given piece of information that has many different obligations associated with it. They might be both regulatory and legal or privacy related, as you'll see. You have these obligations to make sure that you have resiliency and redundancy built into critical data sets that you have as well, just to be able to run your business. And run your business might also be that you can consistently apply the kinds of compliance and legal requirements that you have. Third-party relationships that you have are really important as well. And more, as you'll see as I walk through some of these, some of the specific examples, the third-party requirements the requirements that you have now extend to third parties, and they're very specific. And often now the third parties have to not only attest necessarily that they can meet certain types of regulatory requirements, but that they're actually effectively enforcing the requirements or enforcing the policies and controls that you establish as well. And then finally, if you think about things also from a mergers and acquisition and strategic planning perspective, you're going to be doing acquisitions. You may want to, your company may be, something that is of interest to someone else. The ability for you to demonstrate that you have control of your information, your environments, understand the data that you have, and that you have the right policies and practices in place is actually a big part of the due diligence exercise now. Certainly from a cyber perspective, but really extending beyond that from a compliance and broader data governance perspective. The more you have this set in advance and you're following the policies and controls that you put in place, the easier it's going to be to get through due diligence if that's something that you're going to be contemplating. So again, all of these obligations really touch sometimes the same piece of information, but in slightly different ways. But it doesn't mean that you should look at implementing or establishing practices that are completely disassociated from this set of common obligations. So the drivers around this, obviously, if you think about the environments that we're dealing with today, the drivers are common, right? So you look at the velocity and the volume of data and the mobility of that in the sensitive information. That actually is a big part of making things complicated, because you can do almost anything. You can classify data, you can look at data, you can do anything at lower scales. But as you get into the scales that we're dealing with now and the velocity of the information, it's a whole different dynamic. At the same time, the complexity and the volume of compliance, legal, privacy, cyber, all of those different things that we as compliance people have to think about, they're increasing as well. And when you have volume and velocity increasing in both of these, obviously, it just lends itself to levels of complexity within the environment that you're trying to manage. Obviously, we have hybrid technology and business environments. The multinational operating models that I'm going to walk through here also are pretty important. And then really just headline and business interruption risks. So I spent a little time on this. So there's a way to look at, I call it integrated governance. And if you start to try and break down the major buckets of why you have some set of requirements or obligations associated with information, the three main buckets are information security, privacy, and legal compliance. And privacy really, in a way, is I have it here kind of pictured as an intersection between the two, because It has obviously its own sets of requirements and regulatory obligations in many jurisdictions. But they're really, legal and compliance related in many instances. At the same time, there's a lot of overlap and intersection with information security. So, but these are the three major buckets. And so the other reason I put these together and show them really as associated is because even though you may have, again, a different regulatory obligation for data privacy versus compliance versus information security, the policy or the practice that you put in place to manage and deal with a piece of sensitive privacy related data might actually be very similar to how you want to deal something from an information security from a compliance perspective that deals with something else as well. And so then you can see this extension on the top left. I've got information technology, and then on the bottom right, policies and controls. And again, the idea here is to start to look at the policies and the controls that you can use that overlap with these different obligations, and then technology as well. So let me give you a couple of examples. So one of the things that's very difficult for organizations to do is to be able to understand their critical sources of data. And you'll hear data maps, data catalogs, catalog the data where it is, all those things. It's very difficult to do in many instances, especially from a compliance or privacy related perspective. But what you'll see often is information security has some of this already set, especially from an asset management perspective. And you have to remember that information security has had a tremendous amount of investment over the last 10 years. The information security market is about 10 times the size of the legal or compliance market from a software perspective. And, just think about all the cyber risk and everything that's been out there for so long. And so one of the things that I've recommended and I've worked on with clients before is there might be infrastructure or policies and practices today in one area, like in information security, that you can start to leverage as you're looking at things from a legal compliance or privacy perspective, the technologies, and certainly some of the policies and controls. And the other thing that, and I imagine many of you are doing this, and if you're not, please, definitely look at doing this, is when you start to set those catalogs together, the maps, assets, however you want to map those together, you should be mapping those to your requirements and then the controls. And you should be able to crosswalk that so that you can say, oh, I know I have this kind of data sitting in these systems or in this system. This system then has, these requirements, the information in these systems have these requirements around it. And you should be able to crosswalk that. And that'll help you a lot, especially as, again, you're going to make a change in the environment. You're going to decommission something. You need to retire something. You're going to acquire somebody, and you got to be able to map that stuff back in. So this is one way where I try and help clients realize that you don't have to look at things as, these gigantic, separate, segregated silos that you'll never be able to stitch together. I think in a lot of organizations, there's a lot of technology and practices that you can actually start doing this already. All right, so what are the common obligations? We talked about them a little bit, but I wanted to go through these in a little more detail and introduce one that you may not think about as often. So you've got an obligation to retain data, right? So you've got a specific legal or regulatory reason that there's retention policies around this. I have to keep a particular set of books and records for some period of time. And maybe in some jurisdiction. I have litigation that pertains to certain people or certain systems, and I have to preserve and hold data as well. And that's a form of retention, but we consider it generally separately. We call it preservation or litigation holds, because retention tends to be derived from some sort of regulatory, statutory, or potentially a business need. Legal preservation has slightly different requirements around it, and it tends to be driven by litigation, a criminal investigation, or a regulatory inquiry. And then we've kind of you'll see this talked about a little bit now in the literature, but we're definitely going to see more of this. And this is something we talk now quite a bit about, or we're trying to talk about, is retiring data. And so somewhere in between the point in time that you have an obligation to retain data, use it in your operational systems, and the time you can get rid of it, there may be a point in time, again, where that risk value equation's changing. You still may need to access it. You still may need to use it periodically. But at the same time, you want to get it out of your operational systems. Those operational systems tend to have a lot more people who have access to them, especially for sensitive data. The longer they sit in operational systems, again, those systems may start to decay over time. They're not as maintained as well. And just that combination means I want to take this information. I need to keep it. There's still value in it potentially. I need to keep it from a regulatory perspective. So I want to retire it out of the operational systems and get it into some sort of dedicated environments where I can manage them securely, highly secure, minimize the number of people who have access to it, have clear and crisp access controls to that data as well. And so this idea of retiring data or retiring systems is something, again, you'll see more, I think, in the literature over time. Disposition, this was always one of those things that actually clients struggled with and companies struggled with, which is at some point, the data is no longer subject to retention or preservation. So I can get rid of it. And we wanted to get rid of it generally because, well, we didn't need it anymore. And we're paying storage costs, we're paying infrastructure, we're paying cloud costs. But what's interesting now is we're now at a point where there's an affirmative obligation to get rid of data, to be able to dispose of data that you no longer need. Privacy requirements are one great example, right? This right to be forgotten that is embedded within pretty much all of the privacy policies and statutes that have come out, both in Europe, here in the US, and various states and elsewhere. This concept of a right to be forgotten is an affirmative obligation to be able to go out and dispose of and delete data. And then, as you'll see as an example, in the insurance industry, some proposed language in some of their model rules imposes an affirmative obligation to delete data. And so it's just interesting now, you have to really think about not just, okay, I can get rid of data, it's now I must be able to get rid of data. Masking, which is the ability to potentially leverage and use information, but masking or obfuscating the most sensitive parts of that information that create risk. More and more systems are getting pretty good at doing this within the source. And certainly as you look to move data somewhere else or retire it out, you have to make sure that you have either this ability or some level of encryption to be able to do this as well. And then finally, you have this obligation to secure information at multiple levels. Almost every entity now has multiple levels of security, regulatory, of some sort of regulatory statutory authority imposing various levels of security regimes on their environment, on their third parties, on the data that they're using and how they consume it. So again, all of these, hopefully you can find a way and can leverage common environments and common infrastructure to address more than one of these at any given point. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about, I wanted to use some examples, right, in real world of modern dynamics that are kind of driving information compliance. And I thought I'd use the insurance industry because it's not known as necessarily the most aggressive and cool and hip in adopting new technologies or addressing the most complex challenges from a data perspective. But the reality is, I think we think of it as a very state industry, and it is. But historically, actuaries were really the original data scientists, if you think about it, that we think of as a data scientist today, right? They were using and consuming as much information as they could based on the technology they had at the time. And they developed risk models based on their history of prior loss, prior events to predict future risk. And those models then would tell you how long or how much somebody would pay for life insurance, or what somebody's home is worth and its destruction, what the replacement cost is. Today, insurance companies are doing something very different. They're not just looking at, hey, historically, we've had so many hurricanes in Florida, and therefore this is how much we're going to charge people in Florida for hurricane insurance. They're now collecting and consuming vast amounts of information in near or in real time. And because analytics have advanced so markedly and the ability to crunch huge sets of information, they're able to now develop models almost in real time, or develop risk scores near real time, and look at an individual and understand in real time what this individual's risk really is. And the other thing the insurance industry that has been looking at is what was and this is true across, what was not necessarily a risk before has become a risk, because you can now correlate data back to a person in ways you could not before, or draw inferences and understand data that creates a risk that didn't before, just because you can put so much of this information together. So real-time risk profiling as an example here, I used, think about the number of insurance companies now offering, well, in theory, lower insurance rates if they let you, or if you let them follow your driving habits. And so they're really collecting in real time how far you go, what you've done, how you speed, your acceleration speed, all those different factors are now going into what are you going to pay next month, or what are you going to pay in 6 months when this gets reset. And so it allows companies then to alter the risk models, like, again, in real time. It's also extraordinarily pervasive, because in order for them to do this, it's not just the insurance company. They're aggregating and consuming data from many, many different third-party sources, public data, public sources about you, private sources that are held across the industry. And then they're leveraging, and third parties are, each of these insurance companies, in one of the papers that they had written, have hundreds, in some instances, of third parties that they're working with in these areas, working with some portions of these data. So it's not just what the insurance company has and what they're able to do. It's also obviously what's happening with their third parties. So there's an association called the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. And it's a bit like, for those of us who are members of the bar, we're actually licensed at a state level or in a federal court. But the ABA, the American Bar Association, they issue model rules. And so then the states can kind of look at, okay, well, we'd like the professions to operate pretty consistently across all 50 states here in the US. Here's a model rule around whatever it might be, cybersecurity, or here's a model rule around, updates to our ethical guidelines. And they issue these rules, but ultimately it's the state authority that has to actually say, yes, this is now, part of our practice in that state. Same thing for the insurance industry. They have this group, they develop model rules, they do this research, and they try and come up with ideas that then can get disseminated out to the different states. And hopefully everybody benefits from some commonality, especially because most of the insurance companies work across multiple states. And so they established a working group focused around privacy, especially on this idea of the amount of information that's being created and shared and the like. And so I encourage you, and I apologize, I don't know if I put this in here, but anybody at the end, you can just email me, and I'll send you a link to this group and their practice, because they have some tremendous data on some really good research on like all the different privacy rules, and they mapped them based on state, et cetera. But here's an example. So one of the model rules here that they're introducing is the idea of data retention and deletion requirements that are associated, with personal information. But here's what I was getting to before. It's this affirmative obligation to delete data of a personal nature within 90 days once the permitted use no longer applies. So whatever that permitted use is, which is its own kind of analysis that companies have to do, when that permitted use goes away for you or for the third parties that also are subject to this, which is basically anybody who has this information and they're working with the insurance companies, you actually have to affirmatively delete it. That's a hard thing to do. If you think about it, even in your own organization, if you're not an insurance company, this ability to actually delete data like almost on command like this is pretty challenging for most organizations. The other thing that they're going to do is they're going to have third parties essentially certify that they're adhering to all of the same requirements and rules and everything else that the insurance company themselves are doing. I don't know necessarily how this is going to evolve or look, but I would take a guess that this is going to look a lot like a business associate agreement that you might have with a HIPAA entity or HIPAA regulated entity. Business associate agreements basically go to third parties saying, yeah, I'm going to adhere to all the different things that are subject to the control of the main entity. And the third party requirements will, again, they're just going to extend down to from whatever the primary requirements were for the insurance company. And a lot of this, again, is focused on the use of the consumer's personal information. So they're really focusing on the privacy of the individual here. And it's a lot less about systems. It's a lot less about types of records. And now we're down to who an individual is and whether or not I need their information anymore. All right, so now we're going to shift a little bit and we're going to talk about another topic, which is getting a lot of attention these days and rightfully so. This is around data sovereignty. And so I probably should have put a poll in here to see if you could guess who the person in the picture was. But that's Winston Churchill, and that's in his famous Iron Curtain speech here in the Midwest in the U.S. And if you think about when obviously the internet really opened everything up, and if when cloud adoption also took off, we rapidly broke through anything that looked like a national boundary, right? Information was moving all over, was moving across the oceans, across borders, and that was a good thing. It created tremendous amounts of value and integration across the world, and it really shrunk the world. But at the same time, it started to create other problems in the sense that the distribution of that information was outside the control of nation states at that point. And you might say, well, who cares? This is just one big, happy globe right now. But there were reasons, and actually, either explicitly or implicitly, the fact that certain kinds of information were protected in certain ways in a country, and before, we had cloud and all that. There were reasons that actually work, both explicitly and implicitly. But now, because technology allowed us to do this, that control went away for nation states. And I'll give you one. Oh, and so, anyways, what I talk about now is this digital curtain. The digital curtain is falling because now what we're seeing are countries taking control of this. So the drivers around this were things like the U.S. Cloud Act, and even before that, which codified what was a very famous case, right? Microsoft. And Microsoft, of course, had cloud environments in foreign jurisdictions. In this case, it was in Ireland. And data was coming into their data centers in Ireland. And the U.S. government wanted to reach and grab some of that data for one of the citizens of Europe at that point. And the U.S. government compelled Microsoft, issued a subpoena, and then tried to compel Microsoft to produce that data, even though the data was not located in the U.S. And the court found in that instance that because the custody and control existed by a U.S. entity and U.S. people and U.S. personnel had access to that data, they could be compelled to produce it, and they did. That was a big wake-up call to anybody who was not in the U.S. And we have very long arms. It's called long arm statutes, and we reach out into a lot of different places. And so people were pretty unhappy about that. The U.S. Cloud Act codified effectively what the government got in the Microsoft case. That then brought us to other uncertainty now around a case that's called Schrems 2 in Europe. And that was basically a mechanism which had been set up to share data between Europe and other jurisdictions. Specifically, the U.S. was the issue in Schrems 2. And so this brought up, and basically that decision by the European Court invalidated that mechanism. So this is a little bit still uncertain exactly how this is going to shake out. But anyways, this interest in this interest in protecting individuals in other countries and the interest of those countries is really one of the main drivers. The other main driver that we're seeing in data sovereignty, though, is there's still an interest in adopting these cloud infrastructures and the cloud applications. A lot of these countries are too small to, in the businesses within these countries are going to be too small to necessarily bring this capability, like, in-house, if you will, in the country. They need a Google and an Amazon, a Microsoft to be able to help and access these technologies and infrastructures, along with all the software providers and the SaaS providers. So what I've written is countries are expanding and moving beyond what we would consider a national security model. So before, we would think of national security, okay, this is classified information, it's or it's OFAC or whatever it is, it's subject to some sort of export control. But now these countries are moving to what I call more of a national interest. And so this includes data and workloads that really deal with critical parts of the economy, the financial sector, infrastructure like energy and transportation, and certainly citizens' privacy. So start thinking about this as if you're a multinational company, this is absolutely happening. And think of it from a national interest perspective and not so much from a national security perspective. So here are some examples of some of the laws that are out there, and there's some similarities and some differences. China has a very strict national security and data security law, and it really is, they view it from a national security perspective, where I would consider it national interest. Elsewhere, they consider it national security. So it's a very far-reaching, they take it very serious and severely limits the kind of data that can be shared outside the country, including personal information. But what they define as national security related data or data subject to this national security law is pretty broad. And so to the extent that you're doing work or business with Chinese entities, that's definitely something to take a look at. France and Germany have kind of taken a similar path here. So France has a proposed data security law that would effectively preclude the use of cloud infrastructure that's not owned, controlled, or managed by a French-based entity or French-based resources for what they consider about 600 vital or essential companies. And so, in other words, they're saying Amazon, Google, Azure, Salesforce, whatever it is, if it's one of these 600 companies, they can't go into one of those clouds. They're going to have a separate cloud that is set up and managed by French-based and French-owned entities and personnel. Germany has created what they call the Sovereign Cloud Initiative, and this is going to be run by a subsidiary of Deutsche Telekom. And so they have a mandated set or mandated classes of information of German entities and German related information for its citizens. That information has to be then basically in this managed sovereign cloud by German personnel and German entities. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Dubai have also adopted kind of a similar approach. So each of them, again, their economies, themselves may not necessarily justify a Microsoft or a Google or anybody else necessarily dropping in a massive cloud infrastructure. But those countries want access to this technology. They want access to all the benefits that come with it. So they're actually partnering with some of the cloud vendors to bring in these clouds. They're partly funding them so that there's financially it wouldn't make sense otherwise. So they're helping the financials on it. The other thing that they've both done, and is now similar to what we're doing here in the US, is they've established a classification scheme that basically says, all right, this type of data, these classes of data in the classification scheme, if you can follow these classes of data, this set of data, can go into a cloud infrastructure in country. This class of information might be able to go to a cloud infrastructure somewhere else, and this kind of stuff has to live, outside of a cloud infrastructure. So they've got a classification regime, and it's similar now to what we're going to start dealing with here in the U.S. This is called confidential unclassified information. This is really for government contractors, and again, there's a classification regime and scheme that kind of dictates how you handle and deal with this information. It's not classified data. It's not OFAC related data. It's actually data that has to do with what's called unclassified. But it's still, the U.S. has decided it's relevant. It's a national interest, and you got to remember, again, because the U.S. government is so expansive and it reaches such a broad audience through their contractors, that it's actually going to touch a lot of different companies. So basically, data sovereignty, if you're going to handle this, and you're going to have to, if you're a multinational company at this point, got to really understand critical data and workloads. You've got to understand where the relevant information is created and moved and stored. To the extent that you can, more and more of the cloud vendors, again, are putting resources and cloud infrastructure into different jurisdictions. That will minimize the amount of time it would take for you to otherwise set up your own corporate resources in those countries, and might offer you some great tools as well to manage and classify the data, which is really going to be important. And then again, look at solutions that help you classify this data, whether it's embedded AI or ML, or the ability to integrate AI or ML models, because this data classification piece is going to be a big part of how you manage and are able to adhere to these requirements. Okay, so now on the final theme, which I kind of teased there, which is machine learning and AI. There's more buzz about this than I could possibly cover in the next 3 weeks. So I'm going to try and just give you a little bit of a primer here on some of the key things, right? So first, something to think about: the algorithms behind machine learning and AI. Most of them, or many of them that have been used, are not necessarily new. They use, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but they use different kinds of algorithms that are actually, some of them are decades or even hundreds of years old. It's really the ability to apply these kinds of algorithms at scale over huge amounts of data that's been different. And the compute resources that were necessary in order to apply these kinds of algorithms, again, at these scales, just didn't even exist 5 or 10 years ago. So the legal, I'm just giving you some other examples here. The legal industry actually has been using various ML models now for about 10 years at different levels. Inconsistent, but broadly adopted or accepted as useful. We called it predictive coding at first. Then we ended up with technology assisted review, TAR, in various incarnations. But in any case, there are useful machine learning capabilities in these platforms. Additional AI and ML solutions have been used in supervision surveillance use cases, contract analytics use cases. So it's not like this is all brand new. We've been using these certainly in the legal and the compliance industry over the last 5 or 10 years at different levels, and obviously different levels of sophistication. So there are there's a lot of different ways to break this down. What I'm trying to do is kind of break down some key understandings or key themes for you. So unsupervised machine learning is really where the algorithm, the computer, applies an algorithm and does something without human intervention. So it tries to look at a whole bunch of information, as an example, a bunch of documents, and classify or characterize them without a human training it and saying, this is this kind of contract, this is this kind of contract, this is a change of control provision, whatever it might be. The patterns, the computer's looking at these patterns and trying to actually figure those things out. Supervised learning is where you've got usually a human in the loop somewhere, where it's, okay, I've got a set of data, I'm going to go through it, I'm going to tell the machine or help inform the machine that this information is relevant, it's not relevant, it's classified, it's not classified, it's attorney-client privilege, it's not, whatever it is, right? And on you go. And over time, as you teach the system a little bit about this data, it starts to learn more and more. And so over time, hopefully that human training goes down. But anyways, that's what supervised learning is. Large language models, I separated these out. So large language models is not necessarily generative AI. Okay, so large language models just is really primarily a form of unsupervised learning that is now applied against enormous sets of data that are creating hundreds of millions or billions of objects, creating millions and millions of what are called tokens. And there's all kinds of papers out there. But basically what it allows the systems to do and the applications and the prompts around it is now to actually look at huge sets of information in ways that you could not before. Ensembles are just a combination of any one of these or any set of algorithms, and in a lot of the compliance in e-discovery use cases, certainly contract analytics, contract use cases that are out there, they're really ensembles. You're actually seeing multiple types of algorithms used at various points in the system. Finally, generative AI is what everybody's hearing about now. Generative AI is really where the system is creating new content based on what it knows from the large language models that it's been trained against. So it's actually creating and generating something. It's creating a poem, or it's creating a contract, or creating a document. And it's usually based on some sort of query or request. This is an enormous area, and it's going to have far-reaching impact. And how exactly it's going to impact us all, I think we're all going to probably find out here in the next year or two, maybe more, maybe less. I don't know what's going to kill us. I don't believe that yet, but I guess we'll find out. So a couple of examples here, right? So content classification tends to be a combination of supervised and unsupervised learning. And here, large language models may or may not be necessary. It depends. Sometimes if you're working with a kind of a targeted set of data, you may not need to reach out and use some giant large language model if you're working on purchase agreements or contracts or whatever it is, the kinds of materials that you're used to working with in your organization. You may not need to tap that. E-discovery review has a very particular way, again, in supervised learning tends to get implemented. Again, large language models may not make a whole lot of use in e-discovery. We'll find out. Contract construction, I mentioned, and service interaction, certainly you're going to see a lot of generative AI there, where it's, I've got a question about this, and the large language models and the generative AI are coming back with answers and with documents and whatever it might be. And then finally, a quick set of considerations here. You have to think about whether or not you're going to have your data training a model, others' data, somebody else's model with your data, sharing your data to create models, or sharing your queries to create content models. Each of these has its own potential impact from a governance perspective. So if you're working with your own data and you're developing your models internally, the risk is a lot lower because it's your data, it's your models. You're going to create models that really make a lot of sense to your business, but you're not going to leverage what might be out there. And a lot of investment and money has gone into this. As an example, Bloomberg trained their own model for financial information instead of using ChatGPT. It took them 54 days to create the model running on hundreds of GPUs, which was millions and millions of dollars just to train that model one time. So you're not necessarily going to benefit. Your organization's probably not going to want to sign up to that. So using somebody else's model that's been trained on similar sets of information, but then applying it to your data minimizes the risk, though, because you're just taking the model. You're not sending any information out. You're not using nobody else has access to your data to create a model. Then there's sharing your data to create models. A lot of applications do this in the AI ML world. They want to benefit from a lot of different information, and sometimes getting access to the information is really the key piece here. So if it's only looking at patterns of data and returning back basically something that's mathematical, basically saying I've identified this kind of pattern and I now understand what that looks like, that's different than I have to send the data back and that data now lives somewhere else and I don't even know where it went as they used it to create the model. And then finally, there's this sharing your queries to create content or models. So now ChatGPT just issued a feature that allows you to turn this off. But originally, all of your queries and all your questions that you submitted became part of the corpus and could have been returned back to anybody else. And so I think it was Samsung, if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was Samsung. Their engineers had submitted some code and said, hey, ChatGPT, can you fix this code for us? And it was actually opening up, basically a trade secret, right? Or copyrighted information now all of a sudden became part of the ChatGPT life for everybody else. So you got to really think about that, especially as you look at, other applications, and really make sure you understand how they're operating and what they're doing with your queries. So kind of to wrap things up here, right? A few things. First, try and understand what you have. Now, this doesn't mean you have to understand every single data source and every single piece of information ad nauseum. That would be ideal. I think a lot of people, it's going to be a struggle to get there. So at least start with what we call golden sources and golden flows of critical information, because at least then you can get to the point where you understand at least those critical pieces and how to manage them. And if you have those locked down or you have those under control and you understand them, whatever happens in some of these other environments, you almost don't care about. You can retire those out. You can get rid of them because at least you understand the golden sources and the golden flows of information. I've worked with a bank at one point, one of my partners in a prior company, and they had worked with one of the major banks and got to the point where, these hundreds and hundreds of data sources, maybe there's over 1,000, actually got to the point where really there were about 50 core sources and core flows that were really critical for this one part of the bank. And that's just one example. Try and have a common framework that applies across compliance, legal, privacy, leverage what you can from other areas. Remember, the value of data analytics decays over time, so get rid of what you really don't need, retire that stuff out, and start looking at leveraging AI and ML capabilities. Use the right model. It's not all the same. Spend a little bit of time learning like the core basics of how it operates, at least with respect to whose data, whose model, and where. And with that, I think we're going to move on to questions. I don't see, one of the questions that came up was where to get started, right? So I think, again, that one of the best places to get started is to try and get your hands on these kind of golden sources and these golden flows and the macro security, compliance, legal, privacy, get those macro requirements together and get the right people there too. You're in compliance, you're in legal, you're going to need some help and some friends from security. You're going to need some friends in IT somewhere, right? And so I know that those bridges have been getting built much better over the last 5 or 10 years than before, where there weren't very many bridges really between those entities sometimes. But those Those are really important. So build those bridges, work on those golden data sources, and then let's see. Oh, I've got another question here. Sorry, I'm trying to read in real time here. The first one is, can I provide my email address again? Yes, George T. So it's George T. Tom at archive360.com. Next one is future predictions, RE sovereignty curtains. Yeah. So, again, I think if you look at the way the examples are modeled that I gave you, France, Dubai, King of Saudi Arabia, the CUI stuff coming here in the US, I think that's going to be very common globally. Again, nation states are looking at things now from a national interest perspective with respect to these, critical companies and to the privacy of their citizens. So I think that this is something that continues to move forward in other jurisdictions. The next question is,
sorry about that. I'm back on now. This is Dave. I'm sorry about that.
Great.
I lost connection for a minute.
All right, great.
Thank you. Were you about to take one last question?
Yeah, there was one last question. It was, should there be a single source of oversight and data management? If so, who would that traditionally fall under? Yeah, I don't think so. I think that's always been the idea, that there should be a single, nobody's going to own it. I think the reality is it's hard to ever envision one place where all of this sits. And I know it doesn't sound comforting or good. I've just never seen it really work well. Because again, there's so many stakeholders who have overlapping responsibilities and overlapping needs and interests. And so I think to the extent that you look at it more from a best, or almost like a competency center, or a place where somebody's trying to have the majority of the responsibility, here's how we manage our data catalog, or here's how we manage our data maps and our golden sources, and have that available for all these different parts of the organization, like security or privacy or IT, and have everybody access to that. I think that's probably more aligned with what's reasonable, as opposed to trying to get an Uber data owner over everything.
Great stuff. Thank you, George.
That's it.
And thank you for bearing with me while I was dealing with a few technical difficulties on my end. That was a really interesting and great and informative presentation. We appreciate your time. And again, want to give a special thanks to both George and to Archive 360 for making this webcast possible. Before we wrap up, I want to give everyone a warning that we're going to be closing this webcast in about 45 seconds. So the next thing up will be your CPE exams. So once again, a reminder to obtain your CPE credit for this presentation. Please disable your pop-up blockers to access the exam. This webcast will close automatically, and the final exam will be presented in a separate window. If you have any trouble at all viewing either the test or receiving the certificate, please send an email to webcasts, plural, that's webcasts@complianceweek.com. This concludes our webcast, and we hope everybody has a great day.